it was designed to be fast and furious on purpose for bullshit reasons. Hello, team, and welcome to Bureaucracy. I'm your host, Emily Gross, and I'm very excited today because of Mike Konczal with me, who is the Senior Director of Policy and Research at the Economic Security Project and also former Biden economic official. And we are going to be diving into OBA. Listen, I hate using the acronym because it's not a beautiful bill, but whatever. We have bigger issues to fight. Anyways, we're going to be talking all about this huge budget bill that just passed. Mike, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me on.
So before we begin, what are we drinking?
I have a fine Pilsner beer, a Miller Lite Tall Boy,
Nice.
24-ounce Tall Boy at that. They changed, It's the 50th anniversary, so it's a very off color, which throws me off in the beverage aisle, but it's still perfectly enough to get me through this next conversation.
No, and 24 ounces feels like the correct amount for this. So
yeah, a little supersized for a supersized bill.
Oh, totally. And I'm still in Maine, so I'm having a summer ale from Shipyard. It is what my friend's dad bought, and there's nothing I love more than free beer. I'm still helping him clean it out of his fridge.
Perfect.
Cheers.
Cheers.
All right. The question I always love to ask my guests is, why should we trust what you have to say?
That's a good question. Should probably verify it, but I'll do my best. I have been working on economic policy for about 15 years. I've been writing about it online through my old blog. As a founding member of the Roosevelt Institute, a nonprofit think tank that does a lot of economic policy. I served in the Biden administration as a special assistant to the president and chief economist at the National Economic Council, handling a lot of stuff around budgets, inflation, many other macro and big picture economic topics. And now I help run policy at the Economic Security Project, where we work to build power for everyday Americans and focused very much on policy. So I've been following, in particular, tax and budget and healthcare policy since the Obama years and the Bush years before that. So I have a very good feel in the contours for it. And I've also written for a lot of different publications like The Nation, Dissent, New Republic, and many other places so I love trying to communicate and try to get ideas across to people.
Yeah, no, I could not think of anyone better to have. So let's dive into it. So obviously, also for people that hate using the moniker of OBA, every time I look at it, I kind of think of ABBA, like the pop band, and that makes me feel a little bit better. So why don't you tell us your initial thoughts on ABBA? And by that, I mean the budget bill.
Yeah, we can call it the tax law. I think no matter if you love it or hate it, Trumpy or not, it's a very cringe title. It's a very awful title.
Uncomfortable.
And it's very unpleasant.
Yeah.
It mirrors Build Back Better, which is a Biden era law. All of it's bad.
Yeah, why do they love
quite
B
good.
alliterations? Have you figured that out yet?
I have no idea. Normally they're catchy acronyms. So the pure alliteration is a new frontier. And, for people who haven't been following it, I think the bill, let's talk about it at a high level. So I think it does four big things, does a ton of things. This is going to be the main thing they do. This is their main budget, their main reconciliation bill. So the way Republican policy in particular works is that it's mostly cuts and mostly tax cuts and mostly spending cuts. So they do that through the budget. They pass a budget a year basically, and they won't do one next year, or at least not like this. So this is a grab bag of everything they wanted to do, but it does a lot of things. Four big things I think we can focus on, at least, and then go in some other things. Changes the tax code to be much more regressive with cuts for spending and cuts for high-end taxes in particular. It cuts healthcare, particularly Medicaid, but not solely that, leaving probably upwards of 17 million people will lose their healthcare over the next few years. It does cuts to green energy and green energy tax credits, which I think will make our economy much more brittle and increase energy costs, possibly hundreds of dollars. And last is that it rapidly expands ICE and mechanisms for deportation, detention camps for immigrants, and radically expands the budget for ICE. So we can take those in order. That's the kind of high level thing. So on taxes,
980-page bill, I think.
980-page bill. There's a lot of stuff in it, and there's all kinds of random other things we can talk about. But those are the four big ones. The four big ones your listeners should know about and come away with.
Yeah, let's talk about taxes. Let's dive into it because it's confusing. Because you see a lot of headlines and you're like, I don't. And I tried looking at it. I tried figuring out, because I'm all about, doing your own independent research. I lasted 5 minutes before my eyes glazed over. So please dive into all this new tax code regulation.
Yeah, absolutely. So the big thing it does is that it extends the first term Trump tax cuts. So in 2017, when President Trump was in office for the first time, he passed a giant tax bill called the TCJA. And some of that was permanent, but most of it, a lot of it was temporary. It's going to expire. It's going to expire at the end of this year, in fact. And what happens is that it extends all of it, much of it permanent. In addition to that, and so that's a lot of cuts for everyday people that are smaller, and then big cuts for, particularly people at the top of the income distribution. So basically $1 trillion, about 80% of the tax cuts go to people who are in the top 10%, millionaires and billionaires, very top of the top 10%. In addition, it cuts a lot of other taxes in for rich people, in particular, some stuff with the way pass-throughs or some way complicated businesses that make a lot of money and try to hide a lot of money from the tax code, 199As and a couple other things. Basically, it does this large tax cut that is primarily aimed in dollar terms at the very top of the income distribution. In addition, it does cuts to spending programs, both Medicaid, which we'll talk about as a second thing, because I think it's important to bracket that out, but also cuts to food stamps and food security, which is kind of wild. A lot of the, if you think back to the first term Trump tax cuts or the George W. Bush tax cuts in the early 2000s, they were very regressive. They gave a lot more to people at the very top of the income distribution, but they didn't particularly do harsh cuts on people. People at the bottom still got maybe a little bit. They got some scraps on it. Here, if you're making $51,000 or less, you're probably going to be worse off for this bill passing. That's pretty wild. And something we have not quite seen before in policy, not in a long time at least. And so it will be interesting, the political ramifications of it, but economically, it will lead to a society that's much more unequal than it was otherwise.
And it's hard to even imagine that it could even be more unequal than it is today. So that's crazy.
Yeah, it is. And those tax cuts blow out the deficit probably upwards of $3 to $4 trillion over the next 10 years. So there's different numbers with different estimates, how you measure certain impacts of things, but certainly 3.5. So it not only cuts taxes for rich people and blows out the deficit, it also institutes really severe cuts to healthcare, which again is not what we've seen before. Normally they just blow out the deficit for everyone, or you could imagine a world if you want to bring down the deficit where we raise taxes and cut spending. Here it blows out the deficit while also cutting healthcare for probably upwards of 17 million people. Now, how does it do that? There's a couple different things it does. One is it does not extend the premium tax credits that help ensure that people can get access to the healthcare exchanges. It's a long backstory, but one of the things when the Affordable Care Act, which is often called Obamacare, was passed in 2011, the amount of resources to get healthcare on the exchanges weren't exactly set up right. And they always wanted to go back and fix that. And they did it temporarily during the Biden years. They did it actually during the American Rescue Plan. It was extended in the Inflation Reduction Act. But it made it a little bit more affordable. In fact, a lot more affordable for people to be able to get healthcare on the healthcare exchanges. Those resources are going to be cut. They're not going to be extended anymore. In addition, and this is the big one, is that it's going to force states to get a lot crueler with how it makes sure people can get Medicaid. In particular, it's going to require work requirements, which, at a high level, people might think, work requirement, what's so bad about that? You should be able to get a job if you are able to. But the way it's actually administered, because we do have evidence of this, of what it looks like when people try to do it, is that it's actually really hard to verify if people are working or not, especially in real time, especially for purposes of getting them healthcare. And, people who lose their jobs still need healthcare, right? If you get sick while you're searching for a job, you're not, well, then how are you going to be able to pay the bills? How are you going to be able to find that next job? There are very few people who aren't working on healthcare, particularly on Medicaid. I think maybe some listeners might think, oh, Medicaid, that's the program for poor people or a poverty program or just for children. And it's actually been expanded quite a bit over the last several decades, and in particular since 2011 with the Affordable Care Act. So it covers a lot more people, and particularly covers people who aren't served very well, rural communities, people with small children, people who, work jobs that just don't pay enough that they can get healthcare through their employer. And so by putting really onerous work requirements, which are really paperwork requirements, and they are done in a way consciously to try to knock people off of it. That's where the savings to pay for tax cuts comes from. Just being on Medicaid doesn't get you a check. There's not actual spending with it. You actually have to get knocked off of it to have so-called savings, which, does impact society as a whole.
And also, for the reference, people who are on Medicaid do not get money. They just get healthcare.
Right. Yes.
an important distinction as well for people to remember. There's
Yeah.
no checks going out. It's like if there's a medical emergency, they're not put in a lifetime of debt. That's it.
Absolutely. They're able to, half of births in this country are covered by Medicaid, like
Mhm.
especially for young children. It's really important. People have
40% of kids in the country are on Medicaid.
absolutely. It's a huge number. Because remember, like, people have kids when they're younger, so they're earning less money, so they're more likely to be in poverty. It is a very bad fact about capitalism is that when you have the most resources is when you're too old to have kids often, or at least it's very exhausting to have kids at an older age. And so like that doesn't line up very well. So things we can do like social insurance to make sure healthcare can get to people who have kids and have young kids. In addition, so that's people who are going to lose healthcare directly. In addition, there are different taxes and different things, but crucially, Medicaid spending backstops so much of the country. So a lot of hundreds of rural hospitals are estimated to close. We already saw one.
Yeah. I think we saw Nebraska announce a closing.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And because like Medicaid gets to rural communities where there's just not a lot of employment to generate private sector healthcare and private sector insurance.
Federal minimum wage is still $7.25 an hour. Just
Absolutely.
pushing that out there.
Yes. In addition, a lot of nursing homes. So as a reminder, Medicare is the one that covers older people, but that's often a misnomer because a lot of Medicaid spending goes to older people who are in poverty or have special needs and have difficulty, and they often help support people who are in nursing homes or otherwise get kind of expanded care in Medicare. And there are hundreds of nursing homes that are probably going to close or forecasted to close because the spending, doesn't just go to people; it sets up the whole healthcare market. So, on one hand, Republicans are cutting healthcare for people. On the other hand, or a different way to describe it is that they are reworking the healthcare market and our society to be more stingy, more more condemning, more skeptical that people actually need healthcare in a way that just doesn't line up with what people actually need, which is care. When they're sick, they need to be able to go see a doctor. They don't need an extra level of bureaucratic skepticism trying to push them off of that. And that skepticism extends to some other things about how easy it is to get certain kinds of exchange subsidies and some other things. But that level of like skepticism, coming after 10 years where we've rolled back a lot of that, if people remember healthcare before the Affordable Care Act, where you could lose your healthcare for having a pre-existing condition. The Affordable Care Act got rid of that, and we were starting to build to a healthcare system that, at the margins, at least, was a little bit more inclusive. It's still very brutal, still very bureaucratic, still very difficult for people. But now you have the federal government imposing states to be as brutal as your insurance companies when it comes to Medicaid.
Okay. And for people who want to dive more into this, there are two really good bureaucracy episodes with two like wonderful experts from the Georgetown Center for Children and Families that dives into all of the ways that Medicaid and SNAP impact society, how important it is, how it works, and dispels a lot of the common myths that you've been hearing from talking heads. So highly encourage people to take a check on those. Anyways, shameless plug. Sorry, Mike, please continue.
Yeah, absolutely. Our friends at Georgetown are fantastic on this stuff. And I learned a lot from their reports on this as this bill is slowly unfolding. So definitely recommend checking that out. The next thing it does is it repeals a bunch of the green energy tax credits that were passed under President Biden. And there's some debate and it's still ongoing about how much it's happened, but it certainly is a significant rollback. What's the impact of that? Well, immediately is your energy prices are probably going to go up. I think some forecasts, some estimates are up maybe $100 this year and certainly $200 a year over the next few years. There's AI is going to become more and more part of the economy, and that's a very energy intensive industry. All these data centers that are coming on at the same moment that you are now going to try to pull back a lot of support for solar panels, for wind farms, for alternative green energy to supplement already existing energy. More generally, though, those tax credits were an investment in trying to get the U.S. to the frontier of those industries, because the 21st century is going to be about green energy and climate change, and having an industrial policy, a plan to get the U.S. back to the frontier of investing and innovating in those fields instead of leaving them for other countries and kind of foregoing them. That was a really important agenda item. I think it's really important for the future, and I think getting rid of it under the assumption, like you hear some of these GOP electeds talking about coal will be the future. And that is not what's going to happen.
Been there, done that.
Yeah,
it's not working.
That's not going to happen. And it's going to leave leadership to China, which, is a complicated topic, but having so much industry in one specific country, I think any country, but, trying to diversify that out, trying to give US a stake in that so that there's more of a co-partnership and building that energy infrastructure for the 21st century out. I think it's really unfortunate they're foregoing this. And I think it's going to leave us more vulnerable to energy shocks. It's going to make our economy more brittle when it comes to we just lived through, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which sent global commodity markets and energy prices into turmoil. And, shocks like that, we want resiliency. We want, abundance of energy on this. And, we're pulling that back at a very crucial moment. It's not as dramatic as the healthcare and the taxes, but I think it's quite important for where the economy is going to go. And I think it really speaks to what in part is motivating this bill, which is, a very frontal assault on people's access to medicine, green energy, and there's education stuff we can talk about later. And who wins is extractive, dirty energy companies and rich people and certain kinds of businesses that can claim, essentially tax avoidance. So I think it helps explain a little bit more what's the industry, what's the industry composition of why this bill passed.
Yeah, it's a very business heavy bill. When I was skimming through it, that's what I noticed a lot of. And I was like, oh, if you're a business owner, this is probably not pretty good for you, However, the reality is most people are not business owners, and those people don't have accountants that help them figure out really complex tax codes where they can hide their money, you know? And people are going to be screwed out of healthcare, out of being able to breathe, clean air. It's a complete quality of life decrease through this tax bill,
Yeah, if the White House has a list of all the businesses that support it, and it's like a who's who of the American Mining Association and the Chamber of Commerce, and if you know who opposed it, it was the American Medical Association, the hospital associations as well, people who provide healthcare. This bill is terrible. People who extract resources and pump carbon in the atmosphere are this is fantastic, and that tells you a lot about the bill. The last, though it's not as big of a budget item or budget buster as some of the tax stuff, is still really important, is the expansion of ICE, the immigration enforcement agencies. Obviously, the numbers kind of vary, but essentially it expands it quite a bit and quite aggressively. Essentially, I've seen some numbers that if you combine it together, and it's part of Homeland Security, which also gets separate funding. So you want to make the apples to apples comparison. But it's kind of other countries' military budgets will now be in this one agency, is bigger or as big as the FBI. And, whatever you think of the border and immigration, the way the President Trump and his people have used ICE over the past 6 months has been egregious. It's incredibly unpopular in polling. It is punitive. It involves quota. It's not about trying to find criminals or not trying to push back against cartels or gangs. It's rounding up families, people who are working jobs. People are here as part of a legal process. There's quotas to just go to a Home Depot and round up people. Even worse, or just as bad, is the President Trump is clearly using it as a political culture. He's trying to place Los Angeles essentially under ICE martial law. And it's egregious, and expanding that and expanding the footprint of that, knowing how much it's already been abused and how this new expansion will almost certainly be abused and not actually solve any problems people are concerned about, but instead being used to terrorize people who are here as part of a process. People are here non-violently. People are here as part of families, and deport them to essentially concentration camps they're going to build, or, to foreign prisons that, are torture machines. It's quite egregious. And I do think it's an important part to remember as part of this bill, because it's going to happen. It might happen quite quickly. The political scientist Theda Skocpol had a great piece at TPM, is a website that does a lot of political news. She was talking about, one reason you might think fascism has a check in the United States is that the police are run by cities or counties or states, and for some, and there isn't a federal police force that's expansive. There is the FBI, which has been used to abuse and terrorize civil rights protesters and many other things throughout the 20th century, but it's not as expansive as under presidential control. At least historically has had a culture of independence. that the FBI is placed under such strict political control as we've seen, and they're going to expand out this executive branch police force that's already been abused as a weapon of political terrorism rather than trying to solve things that American citizens are concerned about, is shocking. And I think it's something to remember as all the other things in this bill are quite terrible.
It's all absolutely atrocious. It's so upsetting. It's just speechless, you know? And I always listen, if it was up to me, everyone would just like live happily ever after and like, you know, vibe and it'd be open borders. Everyone could go where they want. You know, we'd all live kind of in a commune, you know, like I'd be really happy with that. Right. But I know that I'm, you know, fairly in the minority of people who feel like that. So it's important for me to put into terms that I think, unfortunately, being, you know, in a hyper capitalist society, for a lot of people, it is a terrible economic decision to go after immigrants, you know? And today, the Secretary of Agriculture said all of the farm workers who are severely underpaid, that are treated horrendously, who are the reasons why you get food on your table, who have now been deported for just trying to make a living and doing everything, right, what they can, a lot of them legally, to be in this country. She said today, Secretary of Agriculture, that don't worry, the people that will replace those farm workers are Medicaid recipients and AI.
It's a thing. And the number was like insane. It was like 30 million people on Medicaid who could be working, who aren't working. And it's like, that's not even, and that's like an order of magnitude off of any conceivable number. And it is telling how much they're just BSing their way through a lot of this stuff. Like there are things where like I'm a liberal person. I don't like conservative economics or conservative politics, but I can understand them as arguments. And so much of the stuff from tariffs to now these numbers around Medicaid and to the now like how they're going to what's going to happen post immigration are just built on fantasy land numbers. Like they just don't add up. And you know, if they weren't wreaking so much harm on people and threatening to do so much more, like you could laugh at it, but it's kind of shocking how little of a plan they have to actually assess the damage that we're going to do to everyone.
Yeah, it's crazy. It's absolutely, they just don't, that's the thing. They just don't care, you know, like, and that's just what it comes down to. There is not 1 ounce of humanity, you know, in this bill, unless you're rich. That's really it.
Yeah. And even little things you could point at, like, are so overwhelmed by the living fact that they're going to make healthcare so much less accessible for everyone. And not just the people who are directly cut off, but premiums are going to go up if you still have your healthcare. Your ability to access a rural hospital or nursing home if you need one is going to be constrained. Like the real ramifications. You know, they passed this bill quite fast. And
literally, it did not have to be passed by July 4th. It is purely for show. It was all a play. It was just stroke Trump's ego. And I mean, even when the House passed its first version, you had Marjorie Taylor Greene coming out and admitting that she did not read the entire piece of legislation. It was like impossible to get through the hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pages. You know, like it was designed to be fast and furious on purpose for bullshit reasons. you know?
Yeah. And it's tough to tell why. Maybe Trump just wanted his ICE army earlier, or they are. No, it's just so politically unpopular and toxic. They just pull the plug on and move on to other things. You know, since it has been signed, we're recording this on Tuesday, July 8th. Yesterday, Trump re-announced his Liberation Day tariffs, and similar to the levels that they were in April, which freaked out everyone. And everyone thought this is crazy high, independent of what you think of Trump or tariffs. Like this is half likely to cause a recession by itself for something that shouldn't do that. And he backed off of it. And now it seems like he's trying to do it again. No one knows if it's serious or not, because like it's always like there's no clue what's actually happening there. But yeah, like they're just like on to the next chaos. And, you know, one thing I'll say about the bill is that I'll say 2 things. One is that it tries to like repeal Obamacare without talking about it at all, which is interesting. Because, you know, 9 years ago when they tried, or whatever, 8 years ago when they tried to repeal Obamacare and failed, you know, they talked about it all the time. They talked about their alternatives. And they talked about a different vision of healthcare, and they had all these wonks. And the effort fell apart pretty quickly because they weren't sure what they actually wanted to do, and and they were like finally playing with live ammo, and they had to figure out what would replace it. and they couldn't come up with something credible on particularly on pre-existing conditions. Now they're doing a big stab at it, but they're not actually talking at all about, like, they're making it sound like it won't do anything. They're saying like nobody's going to lose their health care unless it's, they really don't deserve it. And, they're even some of the conservative wonks are a little bit more serious. They're like, well, the states aren't actually going to kick people off, and I think this is important. Senator Tom Cotton and some others have, the tax cuts start right away. The cuts, particularly these Medicaid cuts, start in 2 years. They start a year and a half. They start after the midterms.
They start in December 2026.
Yeah, they start after the midterms. And I think they think, well, that's going to give them political cover. I think for the people who kind of don't want to do it, because Trump has the real possibility to realign the political coalitions. Like he did in fact make huge gains with working class people and people of color. And not attacking Medicaid and not attacking social insurance, which was like a very key conservative brand for a long time, was probably an important part of that. And, you had some op-eds and other statements by Senator Tom Cotton saying...
Are you talking about Tom Cotton or Josh Hawley?
Correct. Senator Josh Hawley. Leave this stuff alone. You're going to screw up our ability to form a more permanent Republican coalition and make Democrats much weaker. I think there's going to be a push in a year and a half by some Republicans say, let's kick this another year, or let's do this something else, or let's keep delaying these cuts. But that's not how hospitals work. That's not how budgeting works. That's not how, huge operations like the medical establishments work. You're already seeing rural hospitals, we said earlier, starting to go. And I just think the damage is going to start being front loaded. Governors are already going to start reacting. So the idea that I think maybe some Republicans have that they can limit the damage while still getting all their tax cuts is just not going to work. And I think people are going to suffer and voters are going to know who caused it.
Yeah, I hope so. I hope they remember. I give credit where credit is due. And there are a couple of things in this bill that seem not terrible. What has I want to hear what your thoughts are, but what have kind of stuck out to me and be like, okay, I think this is probably good. One is the extension of the child tax credit, and a slight increase there as well. I think also then seniors on Social Security get a higher deduction. But I know there are some limitations with that, as well as some limitations. But Trump did come through on a promise of no tax on tips, right? No tax on overtime. There are a lot of limitations with that. However, that could make a difference. Going to probably encourage a shit ton more of tax fraud, but that's okay. And, and then one of the other things too, which is this, child IRA fund, what are
the Trump accounts? I forgot what the last title was, but these $1,000 Trump
child accounts. For any kid that is born, I think they get $1,000 put into an account to help build interest and build that's wealth.
The expanded CTC is welcome, though I'd note it has been changed so that it requires a U.S. citizen child, a child with a Social Security number, a child who's a citizen, if they have two immigrant parents, two undocumented parents, they no longer will qualify for the CTC. If they have one parent with a Social Security number, they would qualify. I think that's pretty cruel to kick kids who are U.S. citizens who are entitled to a CTC, to kick them off because of their parents. I think that felt unnecessarily cruel for a party that wants to embrace natalism and the idea that they're the family-friendly party. To hit kids at that oblique angle, I think was that undoes some of the goodwill I feel the CTC gave me. So I was surprised by that. The Trump accounts are interesting. $1,000 for kids is good. I'd prefer to see those resources up front and a little bit earlier than just this. And, another tax saving account, even with the initial distribution, richer families can put money in there tax advantaged, and the kind of people, it's not the best tax savings vehicle among the parents have availability to, but if you are a yuppie parent with tons of resources, it is another thing to max out to limit your tax liability, which is not the greatest. So it's good. It's good that we're, kids are getting this kind of default thing. People who are into baby bonds are much more critical of it. And that's an interesting debate to fight. But, at the end of the day, the reality for kids is that half of kids will not have Medicaid, right? Or the half of kids on Medicaid will lose some access to it, either through their parents or through weaker structures. And I think that's the fundamental fact of the bill, is that, the taxes and the healthcare cuts are going to override many of these other things, which are interesting.
Totally. Yeah, absolutely. So this is like kind of a personal question. You worked as an economist in the Biden admin, right? And y'all got a lot of shit for increasing the deficit. This bill increases the deficit by an estimated $3.5 trillion over the next 10 years. How does it feel to watch the Republicans pass this and just kind of skate on through that?
So, I was thinking just recently, like what I expected to happen in January when it was clear, like, like a united Republican governance. You kind of saw the this very tight margins in the House and Senate, in the House in particular. What would I have expected to happen? And the bill cuts taxes more and more permanently and for more businesses than I thought they would. I thought they'd extend TCJA, thought they'd do some stuff around, no taxes on tips and overtime, and some other kind of novelty things that I think impact people a lot less than they think. Um, but the cuts the tax cuts are much broader and bigger than I thought they would be. The healthcare cuts are much more extreme than I thought they'd be. I was genuinely shocked that they cut at the level that they did, that the level that they're projected to do, and that they're kind of dancing around the ownership of this fact. So it's a much more regressive, and the debt is much higher as a result. And I'm quite shocked at that. I'm, if the Democrats had won, like, it would be a different bill. You almost certainly wouldn't have had tax cuts for rich people. You wouldn't have had a lot of this gimmick stuff. You wouldn't have certainly had cuts for Medicare, and I'm sorry, for Medicaid, in addition to the pressure it's putting on the rest of the healthcare system. So, the deficit scolds, like, it's tough because the deficit scolds are always at like volume 11, like they're always turned up as much as they go. And so, like, the minor deficit increases under the Biden, it was complicated because, like, the deficit on the Biden year was always predicated against what was going to happen with TCJA. So, like, what was going to happen this year. So, it's very unlikely they'd get to a deficit bill over the last 2 years. Something that could bring down the deficit in some kind of neutral way. It was always going to come down to, like, this was going to be the grounds under which you either, set the trajectory to be a little bit better or a little bit worse. They sent it to be a lot worse.
Yeah. It must be like a very shitty feeling.
I will say politics is what it is. And so, like,
Yeah.
the one thing that does stand out is I remember one time, President Biden made a statement about the Fed. I think there was actually 2 times, but, like, one time he said something about, like, the Fed might cut interest rates. This was in early 2024. And, like, financial markets did believe this. It was in the data. Like, people thought that there would be cuts in the spring, and the cuts didn't come to the fall when the labor market slowed a bit. And everyone was like, oh my God, Fed independence. Like, can you believe how, like, what they're doing? And they really want to make it like this equivalency thing, whereas, like, in his first term, Trump, like, attacked the Fed, and, like, now Biden's telling the Fed what to do. And it's like, well, no, those are two really different things. And, like, President Biden, like, backed off of it immediately once it was clear, like, the media was reading it this way. The raw attack on the Federal Reserve is astounding to me. Having cabinet secretaries attack the Fed's decision-making, the threats on, like, their autonomy, the clear takeover, the Fed saying what, like, the President Trump saying, not just like interest rates should be higher or lower, like the Fed should be doing decision-making slightly different, which I suppose the president could comment on, but saying, like, the Fed should set interest rates at 1% to manage this deficit that they just blew out, is just like a totally different theory of what's going to happen. And, like, I think there's reasons financial markets have often been quite jittery over the past 6 months, because it's like, the raw assault on, you saw with Doge, you saw with a bunch of other things, the raw assault on the competency of federal policymaking. It's showing up in weather reports, as we're learning. It's showing up in air traffic controls and, like, whether or not planes are landing well. It's showing up so many ways. But when it shows up at the Federal Reserve, once we lose the ability and the credibility of the central bank, once that's lost, that's really hard to get back. You don't just, like, hire back some air traffic controllers and try to get back on schedule. That's something that could really raise mortgage rates, put a when a version of this happened in the UK, they called it an idiot premium, and the idea that we're going to have like an idiot premium in financial markets as a result of what the senior officials in the Trump administration are doing there is like quite shocking to me.
Yeah, no, it's upsetting all around. Listen, you don't have hair, but I do, and I've started getting more grays because since this administration has gotten it, and I will never forgive them for that. Okay, on a micro level. On a macro level, what they're doing to humanity is fucking terrible. On a micro level, the amount of gray hairs I've gotten since January is unacceptable.
Yes, it's
But
maybe it has been way worse. And I will say one of the comforting things is like their poll numbers are also way worse than I'd expected.
And that's good. Everyone's really scared, and they should be, right? But I'm a firm believer in the pendulum always swings. And we are seeing, even with Joe Rogan coming out and talking about all against like these like extreme ICE rates, right? We're starting to see the pendulum swing back a bit. And I'm hopeful that when these terrible impacts take place, people will recognize like, oh, the GOP fucked us over, and they made our lives 10 times worse. And, and I'm hoping that will stick and that we'll see that play out in the midterms and the 2028 election. So
I hope so. It requires Dems to match the moment, which, we're gonna cross our fingers on that one. That's a whole other set of gray hairs. We can talk about a different episode. Yeah.
But no, thank you so much for providing so much like insight to this. It's a really complicated, piece of legislation designed as such. And the end being that it screws over the people that are the neediest and need the most help and anyone who's not rich. So
yeah. I mean, what I'd say for your listeners, like the gaslighting is going to be real. They're going to say like nothing happened or like, don't worry about it. But like, your healthcare premiums are going to go up next year. If you're on Medicaid, you're going to lose a lot of your time to filling out BS paperwork that's designed to make you fail. Your energy bill is going to go up. And if you make under $50,000 a year, you are going to be worse off as a result of this bill having passed the way it did. So that's real. And that's important for people to point out and to know that happened. That was a choice, and we could have made different choices. That would have been better for people.
Totally. Well, Mike, thank you so much for doing this. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me on.
I'm your host, Emily Gross. We'll be back next week with another episode of Bureaucracy.